Anyway, for those of you who watched Susan Dosey's last presentation, it was fun. So it's the whole "Where's Waldo" theme, only we did it on Christian music, and could we identify the doctrinally offensive stuff in modern Christian music? So. A number of reactions, but the one thing I did want to do, the one thing I thought that was so compelling, I introduced this, and I have introduced this repeatedly over the course of the last however many years, this progression of philosophy. And I said, okay, so we start at the top, metaphysics, then what we know as epistemology, what we value, what we know as ethics, how we interact with people's politics, and the last one was aesthetics and art. And the thing that struck me about Susan's Where's Waldo exercise, as we listened to the generalized themes throughout that music, I was less taken, I am taken by, where was I? Oh, her Waldo exercise, it was fun. And whatever your concerns over doctrinal, I'm sure most of the artists are like, oh, we're just artists, we just sing, who cares? But the thing that so caught my attention is how true this effective presentation is. What we got in their artistic expression was a profound illustration of their sense of life. And their sense of life was disaster, chaos, inability, struggle, pain. This is a very, very specific metaphysical worldview. And this is the worldview we have been effectively talking about since the beginning. When your sense of life is effectively hopelessness, and I understand they kind of pretend that, hey, we're hopeless, so we get this really big hope called Jesus. But the reality is you have to start from a premise of hopelessness to get to the place where you can then say we're going to venerate this hopeful thing. So in actual fact, you end up with this very tortured existence, and all of those song lyrics were studies in a tortured consciousness and how truly unintelligible the world is, which exactly follows suit with my progression here. When your metaphysical premise is that the world is fundamentally evil and you really can't know anything, the only thing left is despair, because the world is unknowable and you find yourself totally adrift and then therefore totally in pain. And I think one of the biggest things over the course of my life, one of the biggest things that happened for me, was once I changed that fundamental premise of, no, the world is not malevolent, and I do have the ability to grasp the reality within which I live, then the logical conclusion is, and the effective action is that I can solve the problems of my existence. And so I'm not in despair over tomorrow or today or the challenges that I have. I get up with the expectation I will work today, I will take responsibility for the content of my life, and it will produce a better result. There's a causality between my ability to reason and my ability to act and the results that I produce. So please watch Susan's presentation. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. But more than anything else, as you listen with the intent to hear generally the sense of life all of these artists had to sing about. And notice their fundamental despair, and notice they all start from the same premise. And what you see is this progression in action, and it ultimately reflects in their art. So that was my unintended segue into my overarching speech, or my final section, or my final session today. So, the thing that inspired this year's presentation for me was my headlong collision with socialist, social democrat, social justice warriors in Denver, and how often we see these same fundamental themes echoed in Christian doctrine and the modern current social political environment within Christianity. These quotes, I think, are fantastic. You have my quote from earlier today, be arrogant if you must, be ignorant if you must, but do not be arrogant and ignorant. The reality is, the ravages of collectivism are obvious and they are upon us. The history is obvious, which is why it is stunning to me how consistently we trend down the exact same path over and over and over. George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The man who has no sense of history is like a man with no eyes and ears. Adolf Hitler. We learn from history that men and women never learn anything from history. And this is what is amazing me, particularly in light of America as such. America is a testimony to the antithesis of social democracy, democratic socialism, and the social justice gospel that we're currently seeing in the church. And this, of course, is my last comment to the same idea. Men without the sense of ideas are history. Ideas history are slaves. When you fail to grasp the causality of your own ideas, the roots of where those ideas come from, the foundational principles those ideas are founded on, you have no ability to overcome them. What I've tried to do here is to peel back the onion, that this is all very intentional, particularly within the Christian world. American piety is trending down the path that it has always trended down. It is making the populace, particularly the Christian side of the world, ripe for fundamental tyranny. Unfortunately, most of the time, the excuse of why we're in a bad situation or why things are politically bad is because the church just hasn't somehow fundamentally repented. And for all of the wailing and tumulting, for all the sackcloth and ashes, the entire continents continue to succumb to the socialist menace that has washed across the face of the earth. For heaven's sake, South America is predominantly Catholic. And South America is predominantly socialist. So it isn't the repentance, it isn't the Christian message. There is something implicit to the Christian message that continues to bring these ideologies back to the forefront. And the thing that bothers me is I have yet to hear barely a super soaker's effort, the little squirt gun that you pump up and you shoot people with. We've barely seen that amount of effort in protest. This, and I would prefer not to be so stoic or so serious here, but the fact of the matter is, this is deadly serious. Nations collapse under this body of ideas. And when they collapse, particularly if they started out in political freedom, as they collapse, it does nothing but stack up bodies like cordwood. I'm confident there are a few people who are going to watch this and they're going to be like, John, we believe in the Constitution. Okay, here's the reality. I'm not impressed that you can recite the Constitution. I want to hear you defend individual liberty, without caveat or hedge. I want to hear you shout from the housetops, the singular purpose of government is defending the individual's life, the individual's liberty, and the individual's pursuit of happiness. I don't want to hear you capitulate once to sacrificing for the greater good. No bromides. The people need to give back to some nameless, faceless people. No concession. The people need to join something bigger than themselves. No virtue signaling hashtags. I want to hear you denounce collectivism in all its forms. You need to wake up and smell the sacrifice, because the sacrifice is killing us. So, in the theme of what is killing us, this is a section from a writer called Jay Loren, who wrote a book called Dead Alone. Yes, it is fiction. However, in that book, he has a very interesting discussion with his love interest called Ehu. And he details how truly deadly socialism, progressivism, communism is. So I'm going to participate in some rank plagiarism here. I'm confident he won't mind. And I'm going to read you what he says to his love interest in explanation. That's a little blurry, so I'm not sure everybody in here can read it, so bear with me as I read it to you. Ehud, it's exciting that you're taking on this important fight. But you must understand this is not an academic exercise. You might think you're arguing with a professor in class, but Marxists, socialists, progressives are all cut from the same cloth. They are all the same creature by different names, and they are not interested in a rational discussion. Their singular objective is to establish the moral right to seize production by force. Ehud, you must never forget that the end game is force. Endgame players, Lenin equals Marxist, progressive, socialist. Estimated he killed 1 million people. Joseph Stalin equals Marxist, progressive, socialist. Estimated killed 50 million people. Pol Pot equals Marxist, progressive, socialist. Estimated killed 1.7 million. Mao equals Marxist, progressive, socialist. Estimated killed 49 to 79 million people. Fidel Castro equals Marxist, progressive, socialist. Estimated killed 200,000 people. But compare that number to the actual population of Cuba in the 1960s. Make no mistake, killing for the good of society is standard ideological operating procedure with progressives. You already know that Richard will kill to get what he wants. He just happens to be a bad shot. Ehud, never forget, he is pure poison. So arm yourself with ideas and then arm yourself with a gun. Because if he sees you as a threat, I have no doubt he will inspire his recruits to remove the obstacle. Ryan. Now there are sources that suggest that Joseph Stalin's impact exceeds far more than 50 million people. Because his state-sponsored famine, in other words, he deliberately orchestrated a famine to wipe out an entire section of Russia. And because he wiped out so many people, they're not even sure they have effective data. Plus, the rippling effect of the famine is projected to have reduced the population by over 350 million people. That would place him by far in the top level of genocides on the planet. The number of people slaughtered are staggering because they have been achieved in these numbers. Consider this. These numbers here, all of these numbers, and this is just the high guy. These are just the guys at the top of the food chain. These numbers here have been achieved since the 1900s. Consider that. We're 2119, or 2019, for heaven's sake, right? My brain, come on. Anyway, you get the idea. That's a lot of people based on one ideology. Now, I have established myself long since as an entire critic of modern day Christianity. And I think it deserves all of the criticism that it gets. But the mystic despots and the historical theological tyrants of our age, I mean, they put a dent in the population. And in some respects, Augustine probably has laid at his feet the multiplied slaughter of thousands and thousands of people. But he could never have dreamed of numbers like this. And this is all based on an ideology that's come to its own existence since the 19th century. Now consider virtually the whole of South America is socialist progressive. And we have virtually no way of knowing how many people down there have been effectively slaughtered. And in our modern age, in the last 10 years, briefly take a look at this. This is Venezuela. From 1992, oops, wrong one. From 1992 to 2019, We go from the third richest country in the hemisphere to unarmed citizens massacred by their own government, and they can't feed themselves because of socialism. Social justice, social democracy, all of this, exactly the same thing. And this is what this produced in this amount of time. You saw this slide before, but I have to ask the question, how many times do we have to see this in action? How many times do we have to look at history and not pay attention to the outcome? This is, if my memory is right, that's Marx, I believe. I'm not sure I recognize him. And that's Lenin. That's Stalin. That's Mao. And this guy here, I don't think I recognize. Is that Bernie Sanders? I can't tell. Anyway, but this cycle happens over and over and over. Socialism happens, social system collapses, but it wasn't the real socialism. And we're already hearing that now. We're already hearing this in the present day. Whatever happened before, what is her name, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, she keeps trying to pretend that what she's advocating is not what everybody else did that was bad. This is the good stuff. This is the real socialism. Bernie Sanders, democratic socialism. Same thing. As if the name change fixes it.
The reason it's never worked before is we didn't have the right people in there.
Right. Which, coincidentally, which is why I juxtaposed these two, these guys here have been saying exactly the same thing about Calvinism since the beginning. Well, just the right people haven't done it yet. There's nothing wrong with the doctrine. The doctrine's fine. It's just the right people. If only the right people executed the doctrine correctly, it would all be good. However, but curiously enough, and I decided to go ahead and rip this meme off here, I just reinserted Calvinism. Calvinism happens. The system collapses. But that wasn't the real Calvinism, ever. Unfortunately, it was the real Calvinism. It was exactly the right Calvinism. And when you put these guys in bed with these guys here, dear holy God. This is deadly serious. And it's only made more serious because of these third-rate thinkers basically paving the way for these monsters. So would you go ahead and bring up my first Kasich audio?
The part of the difficulty we have in this town is we don't have leaders who are willing to lead instead of reacting to who yells the loudest.
Or worse yet, feeding on fear.
Well, look at Medicaid expansion. You know how many people are yelling at me? I go to events where people yell at me. You know what? You know what I tell them? I mean, God bless them. I'm telling them a little bit better at this. I said, there's a book. It's got a new part and an old part. They put it together. It's a remarkable book. If you don't have one, I'll buy you one. And it talks about how we treat the poor. I mean, sometimes you just have to lead. It's like fighting ISIS. It's okay. Are the American people ready to put boots on the ground in the Middle East? Mm-hmm. Well, if we don't stop ISIS, this becomes, at some point, a direct threat to the United States. It doesn't mean you don't listen, but you cannot let the yelling and the screaming determine your decision making.
So, Kasich there is all over the map. He sort of implies that the fight for Medicare is the same as the fight for ISIS, and I suspect that if you really pinned him down on it, I'd be like, no, I was really saying it's important, but you got to ignore what's going on bad when you got to do the right thing. But notice he believes that the function of government is the expansion of Medicare, and it's a biblical idea. We got this book, it's got an old part and a new part. The thing of it is, I'm pretty sure, I don't care how many times you read the old part or the new part, it doesn't once mention Medicare. Go ahead and bring up the second Kasich audio.
Walk in somebody else's moccasins. Understand that poverty is real, and that when people are poor, I'll tell you something. I had a conversation with one of the leaders the other day. One of the members of the legislature the other day. I said, I respect the fact that you believe in small government. I do too. I also happen to know that you're a person of faith. Now, when you die and get to the meeting with St. Peter, he's probably not going to ask you much about what you did about keeping government small, but he's going to ask you what you did for the poor. You better have a good answer. I can't go any harder than that. I got nothing left than that, so.
So, I'm going to make a series of comments, but he also made this exact same comment in the presidential campaign in 2016. On the debate stage for President of the United States, he says, when you die and get to the meeting with St. Peter, he's probably not going to ask you what you did about keeping government small, but he is going to ask you what you did for the poor. You better have a good answer. Think about what this says. Let me flip this around. If a presidential candidate stood up in the debate and said, you know, when you die and you go to meet Zeus, and he asks you what you did for the poor, what would you think? Or, let's say, you die and you meet Brahma, and he asks, or she, or whatever that is, says, what'd you do to keep government small? See, on the one hand, we will accept the premise that his mystical, otherworldly doctrine is justification for political action. Because why? Because we happen to accept the premise that this Christian God is behind it. But if I pointed out that he was talking to Zeus, you would think that was nuts. If I said he was talking to Brahma, you think that was nuts. Now, I don't know, maybe some Christians don't, because considering all the songs we just heard, they were hearing voices left and right, so maybe they're talking to lots of people, I don't know. But the point here is that he's basically saying that because I have this otherworldly mystical revelation, that should actually shape government policy. We heard that out of John Calvin. This is disaster. Now, actually, in many instances, the Kasich quotes here are just beyond insane. Because notice, I've read through the Bible a couple of times, maybe once, maybe twice, but I cannot remember ever St. Peter being in charge of who gets into heaven or who you talk to on the day of judgment. So, not only is this man presuming a mystical realm, unless somebody can correct me here, he's making up Christian doctrine. All in an effort to justify what he considers to be valid government action. The two kingdoms, the one kingdom, is in charge of telling what the temporal kingdom should be doing.
Well, actually, Jesus said the poor will always be with us.
Yeah, he did.
And I think the whole thing of being the St. Peter thing, I think it's some sort of Catholic doctrine. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it is.
And I think I have lost my order. There it is. So, you know, I was talking to my imaginary friend the other day, and he wants me to make government policy, so vote for me for president. I was talking to the devil the other day, and the devil said to me, you know, the devil told me, these voices told me I should do this whole TANC seminar this year. Does that scare you guys? It should scare you. But let's unpack this a little further. Let's drill down to, beyond the absurdity of the mysticism, let's talk about the practical application. First of all, society is never charitable, because there's no such thing as society. Society is the abstraction that seeks to generalize the moment-to-moment contemporary cultural practices of a specific geographic organization or group of people. But society doesn't act. Individuals act. Second, only individuals act. Individuals have goods and provide services. Only individuals think, and only individuals work. The product of individual work is called private property. Only individuals can decide what to consume, save, exchange, or give away. Only individuals love because individuals hold values. You cannot divorce love from values. It is a fundamental impossibility. You cannot love what is valueless, contrary to all the songs we listened to. So this is crucial, because if I'm going to give in love, I have to have some value structure that determines who and what I give. So charity is an expression of individuals and individual values. Only individuals can be charitable. Third, government cannot be charitable because government is force. The only way for government to give anything first requires the use of force to take it from someone who made it. Which means they must start with an immoral action, an action of hate, and then take credit for the charity. Redistribution, stolen goods is not charity. John Kasich, you take stuff from me and give it to somebody else, you don't get to consider yourself charitable. You're a thug.
Hey, John.
Yes.
I'd like to enter something that struck me the other day that plays on your point. One of the Democratic candidates, one of the women, and I forget her name, it wasn't Gabbard, said that she endorsed a mandatory government buyback of firearms, okay, private ownership of firearms. She said, you know, which is only fair because the people had to purchase their guns with their own money. So it's only fair that the government would buy those back. What money are they buying it back with?
Right, they're buying it back with a lot of money.
Taxes,
That's
right? And I'm like, well, aren't you a sweetheart? You're gonna buy back our guns with our own money.
And this is what I was going to say next. And it is centrally evil for those with the power of government to pretend to gain moral validation in giving that which they first stole. People do not get to borrow compassion through public policy, but they should receive moral condemnation for voting for government thugs who loot in their name. I actually had this very conversation with my grandmother. We were talking about probably Medicare or some such. And I said, well, Grandma, go next door and demand that your neighbors give you money to pay for your drugs. Well, she wouldn't hear of it. She thought that was the most absurd thing she'd ever thought. Yet, this is the same woman who would vote for politicians who will compel her neighbor to give money so that she can actually get her drugs. And this is the dirty trick that people play in their heads. They fail to take responsibility for the causality of their political actions. And I addressed this early in the second session today. Your non-action, I have totally lost my train of thought, so I'm going to skip over what I was going to just say. So John Kasich's aggressive sanctimony is little more than an open declaration of his moral depravity. If St. Peter is in the business of talking to mystic despots, maybe he will have a conversation with John Kasich. But make no mistake, John Kasich is a Marxist in sheep's clothing. He's a man who wraps himself in the cloak of compassion so he can enslave the world to persevere in his moral superiority. He is a plague on liberty and he and everybody like him is a plague on liberty and freedom. He has no business within miles of political power. And you would do well that he never makes another stab at getting to the White House. And John Kasich is exactly what happens when third-rate thinkers wade into a mud puddle and declare it deep. The catastrophe comes from failing to grasp that the mud puddle is really a tidal pool connected to the ocean. When the tidal pool turns, the church is ill-prepared to deal with the surge. These are socialists in sheep's clothing. They give speeches that pave the way for these wolves that stack up bodies like cordwood. And it's crucial that you understand this. This is exactly what the preachers in National Socialist Germany did. They laid the philosophical foundation in the minds of the people in the church to accept the premise that Jews had money, They had no business having the money. It was the government's responsibility to make sure they redistributed that money to good Lutherans. But it didn't start there. Because why? Now granted, these wolves down here, there's a face that's missing. Which is good because people get real twitchy when you start talking about Adolf Hitler. But that doesn't change the fact that he was an absolute wolf. He was willing to carry to the logical conclusion what these people up here, the theological church, the church leaders, what they said in that day. They paved the foundation. They chummed the waters, and then the big dogs showed up. It sounds good and churchy to advocate the redistribution of wealth in the name of brotherly love, when what you really mean is give a few dollars. It doesn't hurt me. I can pound out a 5 here, maybe a 20. On occasion, maybe I put a Benjamin in the plate. We're all one big happy family, right? We're all for one and one for all, and anyone declaring their individuality is obviously morally bankrupt. But the bankruptcy of the ideas, the central idea that other men owe their existence to people with need, becomes very apparent when the predators roar out of the deep blue sea and consume entire nations. And then Al Mohler explains the carnage, calling the murderers morally complex and history's necessary men. If you're not interested in becoming food for the morally complex, then you must begin to grasp the philosophical progression that I have been explaining now for years. The challenge is political revolutions are always preceded by philosophical ideas. There's first a philosophical revolution that finally persuades the masses to pick up guns and kill in the name of the ideas. Or said another, before the guns come out, ideas are the greatest weapons. You saw this earlier. This is the law of diffusion of innovation, and I talked about it directly and related to Reinhold Niebuhr. He was a thought leader. His ideas. This is the rise of the social gospel, democratic socialism. Those ideas start in the late 1930s, 1940s in America. He speaks right around the 1940s to the 1950s. I'm sure there's somebody online who will correct me if I've got my dates wrong, but I think I'm generalizing correctly. He, among others, are the ones that lay the foundation. The original request for the people on that Facebook discussion about why Calvinists lean politically left is because their leadership, the ones that are dominating the seminaries, the historical intellectual leadership, laid that foundation here. And then eventually it hits an ideological critical mass. And once that happens, like I said, once a product gets to this point here, you can buy it in Walmart. And we are right here. Why? We have generations of young people right this minute who think socialism is the end-all be-all of political organization. They can't fathom why we object. Well, that's the Walmart effect right there. We're right here at this tipping point.
Well, if you talk to them, they believe their lives are going to stay the same as they are now.
You're correct.
Except they're going to get free stuff.
That's what they think.
Right, and the reason I know that is because I work with a lot of young people.
Yep.
And I talk to them and kind of pick their brain and see what they think. This is exactly what they think. Their life is going to stay pretty much the same as it is now. It's all they've ever known in their Americanism. But on top of it, they're going to get a bunch of free stuff.
And on top of that, a lot of these kids already have all the stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but they look around and they say, well, others don't have the stuff I have. And then you see, well, there's this small minority of people that have more than their fair share of stuff. So we should just take their stuff and give it to the stuff that other people have. And yeah, you know what? Because of my white privilege and my white guilt, maybe I should not have as much as I do. Maybe I am being unfairly treated. Maybe some of my stuff should go to these unfortunate individuals.
And it's also a mechanism of passing the buck. Frankly, nobody is standing up to, so lots of Christians with bleeding hearts look over and say, oh, my brother's struggling. And instead of saying, as an individual, this is what I've produced and this is what I have made. And so I'm going to use my values to determine what I personally give to help my brother. Instead I say, I'll give $5 and let somebody else do it.
Yeah,
Yes.
because that's easier.
Because that's easier,
Right.
but destructive.
And you get to feel good about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's how missions work too. You know, and I'll give $10 to the missionary fund and I don't have to go. I can stay right here and do the church thing. And I've seen that as a former pastor, the whole missions thing drove me completely nuts how it works. Okay, and I just saw that for years, that missions supplied the purpose of salving the consciences of most parishioners.
Oh, wow, yeah, yeah.
Okay, and I saw that. I mean, as one of the elders of a fairly large church, when the elders met with the missionary committee, I told them, I'm out of the loop. I don't want any part of it. And that was way back. That was 15 years ago. I mean, I got it at least in part way back then.
I mean, so the truth is, when you stand in front of St. Peter, quote unquote, really, truly, it's going to be what individual did you give value to? It's not, how did you help the poor? It's where did Jesus say, you put clothes on my back when you helped your brother? I mean, so it's about what we each, that's the call to action. It's not about forming groups and forming collaboratives to dole out money. It's about what did I do and how did I help another individual. And this is backing up just slightly, but I think Venezuela is probably our most poignant example in today's world, and it's not getting a lot of news time, right? So it used to be the third most wealthy country in that hemisphere. So I was trying to look it up, but based on gross domestic product, now they're 62nd,
Wow.
just so you know.
I didn't know there were that many countries in that part of the world. There must be.
The entire
Yeah, yeah.
northern.
Well, and think what that means, because the whole of South America are socialist dictatorships. And socialist dictatorships have two incurable vices. They run every economy they touch into the ground. Cuba, Venezuela, Soviet Union, all of Eastern Europe, South America. Detroit. Half of California. Denver's on the way. The second incurable vice is they are always one-party dictatorships governed by police brutality, forced imprisonment for political offenses, and the abolition of individual rights. Socialism will initiate violence in the United States. Actually, it already has.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, there has yet to be a country that successfully resisted their violence. Probably because the populace was too stupid and gave up their guns. Actually, it's not a bad idea to get some guns. In the meantime, you can arm yourself with some crucial concepts. And here's the important part. You must talk about them. Stop being quiet. I am always amazed. Not that social media is the end-all be-all of public discourse, but it's a dominant trend. And I am always amazed at how often political leftists feel the divine right to filibuster. And the moment anybody with a conservative / individual liberty perspective chimes in, calls them to account for their misidentification of reality, it's always the person who's trying to appeal to reality are the ones who are supposed to shut up. We got to stop doing that. We got to stop pretending that this is just some, as the letter to Ahu was, this isn't you just arguing with your college professor. This stuff gets real pretty quick. Stop letting Marxists in sheep's clothing pretend they're the only ones who get to talk in public. And it's crucial that you understand this because I really think when people hear social justice, they think it's, well, okay, so I have a few extra dollars, I should give a few extra dollars because I feel guilty on some level. No, that is not what this is. Social justice and the $1 crime. Social justice is if you have $1 more than her, independent of your action, independent of your work, independent of what you produce, if you have $1 more than her, you are guilty of a crime. Now hearken back to my second session. John Calvin, what did he say? Ultimately, he thought justice was directly related to individuals giving to the poor. If they weren't giving to the poor, it was injustice. And it was the church's job to tell civil government how to make sure you gave money. This is crucial that you understand. This is not, oh, you're just not charitable today. Social justice means, managed to go the wrong way. Social justice means you're guilty of a crime. Let that sink in. So when you hear somebody very proudly proclaiming that they are social justice warriors, they actually mean warriors. They mean people who will commit violence to make sure you conform to what they think is justice.
They don't understand what justice means then.
No, they do not. And don't confuse social justice with an act of benevolence. What the preacher means to say is that if you have $1 more than anyone else, you're guilty of a crime. And it does not matter how you got that dollar. It doesn't matter if the other people are rotters, thieves, and bums. The many names of disaster. You can always tell how toxic an ideology is by how often they have to try to rename it. These are all names of the exact same thing. And it always happens because, they start talking about being a socialist and then everything collapses. And they're like, well, we'll call it communist. And no, that's not really communism. We're going to call it something else. Oh, we're progressives. Oh, we're National Socialism. Oh, we're Democratic Socialism. And why are we Democratic Socialism? Well, because they already took over National Socialism. And if we vote for Democratic Socialism, if we vote for it, then it's more valid than if somebody just dictated it. This is the social gospel. This is the Green New Deal. Don't be fooled. Don't be fooled that thinking a new name applied means we have a new socialism. This is catastrophically untrue, and we do see this with Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and their endless effort to try to pretend that what they're advocating really isn't what they're advocating. The modern buzzword is democratic socialism, implying if you vote for socialism, it makes it a better version. First, National Socialist Germany voted for socialism, and the disaster was pervasive. Second, it's not moral for 51% of the population to enslave 49%. America is not a democracy. It is a representative republic. And the founders were just as much in opposition to democracy as any other tyrannical form of government. Rule by the mob is not a better mob rule, not a better tyranny. Ben Franklin was fond of saying, democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting for who is lunch. Why do the new Calvinists consistently come out and are antagonistic to America? Why are the seminaries and the primary thought leaders in American piety in so much fundamental opposition to America? And Paul says this repeatedly, and he is dead on right. Americanism undermines the institutional church at the root. They hold the same fundamental premises. That man has an obligation to sacrifice. Sacrifice is the ethical ideal. Man's primary responsibility is to submit to authority. Government is dictatorial. They try to pretend it's benevolent dictatorship, but it's still dictatorial. And it has a utopian dream. By contrast, America is founded on the premise that the individual is primary, that the ethical standard is ethical egoism, that man is an end in himself that is designed to pursue his own life, his own liberty, and his own happiness. And that drives the religious people nuts. You can't sing a song about fundamental inability and the need to be saved from your own disaster if you fundamentally believe that you have the right to your own life, your own liberty, and your own happiness. The purpose of government is limited to the people's consent. The government doesn't get to ask and act until we say, okay. Independent of that, they are entirely restrained. John Kasich is wrong. The issue is not the principle of limited government. The issue is stopped government. The single greatest threat to the liberties of the people is government, period, not its size. And the dream is for every man to explore in accord with his own, his own life in accord with his own, explore his own ideal in accord with his own conscience. This is why they stand apart. America is an affront to Calvinism because America succeeded because of human greatness. The metaphysical premise of Calvinism is human fundamental sin. America is founded on the premise that individuals are fundamentally great. Because individuals were liberated, they were able to do justice and righteousness, and they did. The reason the church sides with tyrannies and dictators and squalor and failure is because these socio-political realities reinforce the doctrine that make the church relevant. This is why every socialist country since the inception of socialism has in short order reduced to eating the family pet to stave off starvation. Nothing spreads misery and injustice and vicious inequality faster than the rise of socialism. And here's why you must fight. The social justice warriors are not paragons of benevolence. They are the harbingers of the war to come. They do not have passion for equality. They are not compassionate. They possess a vicious hatred of human existence. They hate the good for being the good. They don't lean left. They are leftist ideology. If you do not have a sense of history, you're like a man without eyes or ears. If you can't pay attention to what's already happened over and over and over, you deserve the outcome that you get. Remember, adults get the government they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justin.
Yes, sir.
And this is really a two-part question. Because you were talking about American greatness, and I just can't help but think back to Ronald Reagan. Because that was the message that he always preached.
Sure.
America's greatness, but the people, the greatness of the people. Do you think we will ever find another Ronald Reagan? And if we do you think we will have a political party that has the courage to run him?
Well, I think the answer is before our faces. I think the answer is yes. I think Donald Trump, for whatever you think of him personally, he has proved to be an extraordinary executive. And the Republican Party is doing everything it can to figure out how to run away from him as fast as they can go. Why? Because they're statists. Most of the Republican Party, most of the people in political power, are statists just like their political left counterparts. This is why John Kasich, I mean, we would call him a rhino, but he fundamentally believes in the exact same fundamental expectations of his political counterparts on the left. He is a Marxist in sheep's clothing. So the answer to your question is yes and yes.
I mean, if you judge Donald Trump through the prism of total inability versus, well, the total inability of man, which was John MacArthur's coming out of the closet, yes, I'm a new Calvinist, 2008 T4G conference, where the title of his message was the total inability of man, and real laugher here, totally distorted history by saying that Protestantism was absolutely unique in holding to the total inability of man. Well, Donald Trump if you judge him by those two camps, inability of man, ability of man, he's clearly in the ability of man camp.
And they can't, and the
Okay.
thing about Donald Trump, and I understand this is a very volatile subject, but the realities are what they are. Donald Trump has, what, 50 years? No, 40 years of production, building. I mean, yes, he's had failures, but he has recouped those failures multiple times over. He has enormous amounts of success. He's a self-made man who happens to like himself, and they hate him for it.
And that's your key, that's how you know.
Say more, please. That's how you know.
That's how you know he's all for the ability of man, is that they hate it.
Oh yeah, they hate it. And they will refuse to give him, I heard recently somebody told me, well, he's just a con artist. And I pointed out, I said, so what's your definition of con artist? And of course, you tell people you're going to do one thing and you bilk them out of all this money and that's how they got rich. And I said, well, if that's the case, they can't be Donald Trump. Because a con artist has one shot to fool you. Donald Trump's been in business for 40 some odd years. And oh, by the way, politically, he has just endured probably one of the most intensive anal exams any human being has ever gone in. And they still can't find a problem with what he's done. He must have been beyond your wildest imagination squeaky clean in business. Because if there was a problem, they'd have shown it up. They'd have told us.
And he keeps triggering them. You gotta love it. You gotta love it.
He is what I wish more people on the political right and Christianity, I wish this is what they would do. I wish they would stop apologizing and say, no, stick it in your ear. This is the truth. And I'm going to keep saying it. And I don't care how offended you are. And if there were, frankly, Donald Trump is the byproduct of our political weakness. If we had more people willing to stand up and be unequivocal, we would not be where we are. We would not be one election cycle away from this country descending into what is probably going to end up being a civil war. And my real concern, and I said this earlier, and I'll reiterate because I think it bears mentioning here. My real concern is the counter philosophical movement. Right now, and I said this before, particularly in the Christian world, we tend to presume that the reason we're trending politically left is because we have abandoned God's moral standard. So, if we didn't have sex out of wedlock and we didn't let homosexuals do bad things, that somehow this would all politically fix. When in actual fact, those are ancillary issues to the central premise. The ability of man, the non-ability of man. Man's metaphysical state, is he capable of understanding the world in which he lives, or is he not? Well, if we have a pendulum swing the other direction, my concern is that we're going to head back, that the Calvinists are going to get their way. They're going to end up with that theocratic state that is oppressive. Now, there are some caveats and addendums to my thoughts on that subject, and my real concern is that counter shift. Right now, pretty much the amorality of the left is going to catch up with them. You can't denounce human judgment across the board and then expect people to make good choices. It's just not possible. So eventually the collapse, the bankruptcy in that particular perspective, which is where the political left is, you can't make a moral judgment about anything, which means you can't make a judgment about what is the right choice or the wrong choice, which eventually that collapses because people make bad choices, and reality is it's a great punisher. Eventually that pendulum is going to head back the other direction. And I think that in that pendulum swing back, if we can survive this trend and push towards socialism, the trend back, I think, will be religious theocracy, and I'm concerned about that. So did I answer your question? Did I say too much?
Yeah, you answered my question a while ago. But you never say too much. You can keep talking all you want. I don't care. I love listening to what you have to say, so keep talking.
This is a sidebar or a bunny hop. I'm not going to hum the music, the bunny hop music. But I have a friend who is always posting this meme on Facebook I have two of them that do this now. That the downfall of our schools, and because I've been a school teacher, believe it or not, almost 46 years, the downfall of our schools is because we've taken God out of the schools.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I go, and number one, he's not supposed to be there in the first place in public education, and number two, if you are a believer and you're going to a public school, God's not there?
Yeah, God's not with you.
Where is your life? Where is your walk? Where is the real testimony of Christ? It's what you have to offer. But they're saying the government has to provide God in the classroom. And I'm saying, which, and then my answer to her was, which God do you want in the classroom?
Yeah, high
Buddha,
five.
Allah, you know, who? Which God? Why not just walk the walk and talk the talk and be who you say you are, and then God is in your public school system.
Yes.
And but again, even Christians want government to solve
The problem.
the problem
Yeah.
instead of being
Being individually responsible. Yeah, being individually responsible, which is what Tiffany mentioned earlier.
All I know is if your children go to a Christian school, they are going to get an absolutely, totally distorted
Sure.
teaching on history. Okay?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean-
we homeschool,
Yeah.
but we use a curriculum that's published for Christian schools.
Right.
We're even Sam even has to deal with that herself when she's teaching the kids at home. I mean, you just had something.
No, the Puritans were not capitalists.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's a great one.
Or even or even we have a lesson about you have a lesson about government and taxes, and then they go to Romans 13 and take Romans 13 completely out of context.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and so if you're not paying attention, we have to stop and say, okay, this is what you're saying here, but let's think about this here. I mean, so even when you're homeschooled, you gotta really do a lot of work.
Yeah.
It's funny that you make that comment about Puritans being capitalist. As I was doing my prep work, one of the sources that I found kept trying to make the case that John Calvin was the father of capitalism. And I'm just like, I'm like beside myself. And this is a guy who teaches at university. I'm like, that's just nasty. That's crazy talk. But anyway, any other questions? If no, have a good day, guys.
All right. Thanks, John.